Hello everyone. My name is Avantika Goswami from the Center for Science and Environment, joining you here from New Delhi. I have my colleagues here. We are the Climate Change Program at CSE. I have Trishant Dev, Seher Raheja, and Tamanna Sengupta here with me. And we are here today to have a little chat, a CSE live chat about an upcoming climate conference, which will be held in Bonn, Germany. The significance of this particular conference, it's a conference that happens annually. The particular significance of this is that it's a midpoint between the major climate summit that takes place at the end of each year. So the most recent climate summit, which took place in December 2023, was COP28 in Dubai. And the next installment of that is COP29, which will take place this year in Baku, Azerbaijan. And the midpoint of that is the UN's Mid-Year Climate Summit in Bonn, also known as the Subsidiary Bodies Meeting, of which it's the 60th installment. Um, but essentially, this summit is going to be a stock taking process as well as a direction setting process for how the rest of this year, the bulk of this year, is going to progress in terms of climate action, climate ambition, progress on different themes which are most relevant for climate policy. So, climate policy is integrated into every sector of our economy, every aspect of our lives, in fact. So, to truly understand it, it's important to understand the world environment in which this policy is being set. So, since COP28 in Dubai, where the outcome of the first global stock take was concluded, since then, a lot of things have been happening. It's been a busy time, although we are only in month 5 of this year. Um, the Firstly, the COP28 presidency of the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, handed over the COP presidency to the country of Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan is an emerging economy. It is also becoming a major oil and gas producer. And it has a tough task on its hands because this year it will have to precipitate an ambitious outcome on the issue of climate finance. But coming back to world events for a minute, this is a very crucial year because it's an election year, something like 60 plus, at least 60 countries, more than that, definitely, um, are going to polls this year. So over half the world's population is going to be voting for a change of their national governments. At this point, by May, we've already seen Indonesia, India, Bangladesh, Iran, Russia, Pakistan. These are all countries where elections have already taken place or are taking place. As the case of India right now, world's largest democracy of 1.4 billion people are currently voting as we speak. So it's a very crucial year politically. So a lot of political factors will be influencing the kind of commitments that countries make on the climate stage. In terms of climate policy themes, finance and fossil fuels and the energy transition, these are pretty much the two big pillars. On the issue of fossil fuels and the energy transition, we are seeing some positive developments through this year. For example, the IEA came up with a report recently that suggested that the increasing penetration of electric vehicles is eating into the world's hunger and demand for oil. So that's positive, and it's a positive global shift. On the other hand, you still have a number of countries, especially rich developed countries, who are still extremely fossil dependent. So the G7 countries came up with a declaration a few weeks ago where they seemed to give a commitment to exit coal, but not really. They've kind of given a vague commitment of maybe in the 2030s or maybe in line with 1.5C is when we will exit coal. But that's a problem because from a climate justice perspective, you need those historical polluters to phase out fossil fuels first and create carbon space for the rest of the world, the developing world. On the issue of finance, the World Bank and IMF spring meetings took place last month and spotlit a lot of the big issues like the debt crisis, the need for greater financing for climate and development for developing countries. We wouldn't say the needle shifted a lot. It's not like a lot of transformative solutions were really passed as we hoped, but the conversation around issues like debt is really escalating, and it's making its way into mainstream policy discourse, and that has to extend to the climate finance conversation as well. So I think with that context setting, we'll get into the actual UN climate process. So this year, climate finance is the biggest header, and the other big issue is the issue of updating of NDCs or climate pledges, which is due in early 2025. But we'll come to NDCs in a bit. We'll start with the headline issue, climate finance. So I'll turn to my colleague Seher, who has been deeply embedded in the finance negotiations, discussions, tracking the different country positions. So Seher, NCQG, fun acronym. What does it stand for? What is it? Why should we be more interested in it?
Thanks, Avantika. So some quick context to begin with. NCQG is the headline negotiation for this year, and it stands for the New Collective Quantified Goal on Climate Finance. Essentially, what that means, it's a new climate finance target that countries are hoping to set collectively with consensus. And it's a target that is to provide money from developed countries to developing countries in order to finance their climate action. So this year is important because it is at COP29 in Azerbaijan that this goal needs to be decided. We've actually made an explainer video on NCQG as well, so please check that out if you are interested.
Yeah.
Now, this target for provision of finance is also supposed to begin from a minimum of $100 billion at least, and taking into account the needs and priorities of developing countries. So that's the overall context. Now, at COP28 in Dubai, the last big climate change conference, essentially countries had done a lot of negotiations throughout the year, and they decided that it's time now to shift from purely technical conversations about this target onto a more negotiations track, which means
the political process.
Exactly. So other than just discussing the structure or the design and different technical parts of what this goal should look like, even though there isn't enough progress on that, in my opinion, they said that they need to fast track the process of countries coming together and expressing their opinions and needs, because at the end of the day, consensus among countries at the negotiations is what is going to escalate and actually lead to an outcome that is actionable.
Yeah.
So now in 2024, the first meeting among technical experts as well as countries took place just last month in Cartagena in Colombia.
Yeah.
And there were several interesting points of both convergence and divergence among developed and developing country groups that emerged. So I'll just give you a few examples.
Yeah.
One of the major ones is the contributor base. So developed countries, which are mostly wealthy, industrialized nations, more or less what we call the global north, have been arguing that the contributors for this new climate finance goal should not remain restricted to the countries that we called developed. They're saying that new economic realities must be reflected in this goal, which is basically a hint at saying that certain developing countries should also be included as contributors who will provide this finance.
Right.
But developing country groups, all of them from the Arab group, African group, like-minded developing countries, various groupings have all been consistently saying that this should not be the case, and that according to the text of the Paris Agreement, which was a consensus-based process, the money should only flow from developed to developing countries.
Yeah.
And related to that is the issue of the recipient base, in that developed countries are saying that there needs to be differentiation or some distinctions and criteria for assessing eligibility of who gets this finance from the developed countries. But there again, developing countries are saying that everybody needs it. The needs might be different.
Yeah.
Some are more adaptation centric, some are more mitigation centric, some are much more, some are much less in terms of absolute numbers.
Yeah.
But it should be a goal that's applicable to all without any conditions that come disguised as eligibility criteria.
Right. Didn't one country also suggest that the NCQG could be a voluntary goal, which is definitely it's a specific point of view, not something we would agree with, but
not necessarily. And that country was, well, the United States, which is one major player in climate negotiations for the past several decades. They tried to use, they suggested through language in the Paris Agreement that this is a goal that countries can choose to opt into, but there was really strong pushback for that point of view. And it was said that and developing countries stood, held firmly to their position that this is not a voluntary goal. This is an obligatory one. This is more about historic responsibility being manifested as a finance target, because finance is what enables climate action.
Right. Right.
So
So what do we
yeah.
expect from Bonn? Like what is specifically planned for the NCQG?
Right. At the mid-year point, midway point for the year, the 10th Technical Expert Dialogue, which is another one where experts and civil society groups are going to come together and discuss some of these elements like structure, time frame,
Yeah.
recipient base, contributor base,
Mm.
financial instruments, give
Right.
a little bit more deliberation on that. And the
Yeah.
second meeting of negotiators. So from Colombia, the conversation that different countries were having, that's going to continue in Bonn,
Yeah.
and hopefully there's going to be progress made towards
Yeah.
a negotiating text.
Right. So that's key because then you arrive at the text, hopefully in good shape, and then take that forward to COP29.
Yeah. Although, as someone who's been tracking the negotiations, at this point, it doesn't seem to be close to all mutual consensus all around. So maybe that's why Bond's going to be really important. If that process gets accelerated,
Yeah.
then you're going to get into COP29 in a good place to have a good outcome in a timely manner. But
Right.
but let's see
Right.
what happens.
Right. So I think it's going to be really important at Bonn for developing countries to be united in their demands. So unity amongst the global south to ensure that those ambitious demands can be escalated, amplified.
I would say so.
Another finance point, very quickly, Article 2.1c of the Paris Agreement, very niche and very specific and technical. But could you just, in a minute, summarize what that's about and what's potentially going to happen at Bonn?
Sure. So Article 2.1c is the article within the Paris Agreement that talks to the long-term goal of the Paris Agreement in relation to finance. So what it asks for is all finance flows, interpreted as all finance flows all around the world, to be in line with climate consistent objectives, which means low emissions and climate resilient development. So at Bonn specifically, the conversation at a workshop on this subject is going to be about investment in adaptation and how adaptation and finance for adaptation can be furthered by making broader finance flows climate consistent.
Right,
That's as
right.
simply as I can put it in one
Yeah.
minute.
Article 2.1c is a space to watch. It's something that we are also working on, but essentially there are a lot of differences in terms of how the article is being interpreted between by developed countries versus developing countries. So definitely an emerging space to watch. So thanks, Sahir. I will now switch to come to Tamanna. So the big outcome of COP28 was the global stock take, and it was an intensive 3-year long process. And we don't stop there. This time at Bonn, there's plans for a GST, a global stock take dialogue. Could you tell us a little bit? And Tamanna was deeply embedded in the global stock take negotiations in the process. So what is this going to be about? What's going to happen in Bonn?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Avantika. So 2023 was known as the year of the global stock take, like this year is the year of finance or the GST. The GST was a one of its kind assessment of all of the countries and their progress towards the Paris Agreement goal. And there was a final GST conclusion that happened at COP28 in Dubai. It had many important points that you can take away, but the top three that we would note is first on energy transition. It made a historic call on country parties to transition away from the use of fossil fuels. Secondly, there was notable wording that said that there has to be better non-debt creating finance from developed nations to developing nations. And the third most important point is that, as Avantika mentioned, there are updated nationally determined contributions coming from countries by Feb 2025. So the GST noted that the new NDCs have to be informed by the outcomes of the global stock take. So what we can expect from Bonn is the first edition of the annual Global Stocktake Dialogue. It is expected to serve as a platform where countries can discuss best practices or their progress towards making their NDCs informed by the Global Stocktake, how that's progressing. But from my perspective, there must also be a discussion on whether or not the other recommendations that the Global Stocktake gave are actually being followed by these countries and also being followed in line with equity and common but differentiated responsibility principles, especially given that we've recently seen a lot of reports of fossil fuel expansions. And we've also seen, as you mentioned, the G7 countries not really being able to come to terms with a particular phase out date for coal or other fossil fuels. So that's something to look out for.
Okay. So thanks so much for that. So I'll turn to Trishant now. So the mitigation work program, another negotiation track, it's been active since 2021, first proposed in 2021. So what's happening on that? What is expected at Bonn? I know some very specific events are planned around that.
Yeah, thank you, Avantika. So, a key outcome of the Glasgow Climate Pact at COP26 was the mitigation work program, which was formed to urgently scale up the mitigation ambition and implementation for countries. And the mitigation work program was mandated to hold two global dialogues and investment based events each year on mitigation themes. So the first global dialogue took place in Bonn last year. The theme was energy transition. And then there was a second global dialogue and investment event in October at Abu Dhabi. It was on energy transition in transport systems. Now, at COP, the debate was about how to include the findings of the two global dialogues in the decision text that the parties were going to adopt. And then there was some issue around developed countries wanting developing countries to scale up mitigation ambition and include what is called a high level message. This was actively opposed by developing countries. This year, the first global dialogue is and the investment event is scheduled to happen at Bonn, and the theme is cities,
Urban
urban
systems.
systems.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry.
It's a tough list. Yeah, cities and urban systems is the focus this year.
Yes.
Yeah. So the mitigation work program, it was proposed by the United States and developed countries as a negotiation space where we talk about how you enhance mitigation ambition in the NDCs. But it's been a bit contentious because developing countries have felt that we already have NDCs that we have nationally determined in accordance with our context. And now these additional pressures to scale up mitigation ambition are being placed on us without a corresponding conversation of financing and support. So the political negotiations around the mitigation work program have been fairly strained, and not a lot of progress has been made.
Exactly.
I think these global dialogues and investment focused events are a separate space from that, where the chairs are attempting to create a constructive space where countries come together and discuss barriers, opportunities, challenges, technical challenges around mitigation ambition scale up. So it's interesting, and there's really a need for these outcomes in the technical discussions to link to the political process, because
Yeah.
the political process is frankly a bit hamstrung from what we saw in Dubai.
Completely. Yeah.
So with that, I'll stick with you and come to the burning question of Article 6. Something I feel like very few people understand, but a lot of people are very interested in, and you are an expert on that. So, Article 6, specifically 6.2 and 6.4, which are the carbon market mechanisms of the Paris Agreement. What's up on those? What's happening?
Yeah, thank you. So, briefly to describe what Article 6 is, uh, Article 6 basically envisages cooperative approaches for countries to fulfill their NDCs, the nationally determined contributions. Under Article 6, there are three mechanisms basically. The first two are market based mechanisms, and the other one is non market based mechanism. Under market based mechanism, there is Article 6.2 that uh, provides for countries that can sign bilateral deals in a decentralized manner to enter into agreements for uh, fulfilling their NDCs through exchange of, you can say, carbon credits. And then there is Article 6.4, which envisages a centralized carbon market run by UNFCCC, which is basically a replacement of the Clean Development Mechanism. Now, under Article 6.2, there were procedural discussions how to take this forward at Dubai on issues like authorization. Now, authorization is when a country decides to sell the carbon credits to another country or a non-party stakeholder. That's the process of authorization. So there was discussion around the authorization process, the revocation of authorization process, and there were a lot of differences between countries on this. And then there was Article 6.4. So basically, the mechanism or the framework of Article 6.4 is being worked out by the supervisory body. And the debate was around the recommendations that the body had provided last year. mainly on removal activities and methodologies for activities.
Carbon removals.
Yes.
Okay.
So since then, the supervisory body has held two meetings in the intersessional period, the 11th meeting, the 12th meeting, and it's about to hold, the 10th meeting, the 11th meeting, and now the 12th meeting is supposed to be held. And it has dealt with some of the key themes like how projects would be registered, how the projects would be verified, and such other questions. But most importantly, the body has dealt with the question of uh, appeals and grievance process.
Yeah.
Now, this was something important that everyone was looking into, and yeah, so this was addressed in the last meeting.
So the appeals and grievance process under 6.4 is somewhere where we have also made recommendations. CSE made a submission, and we submitted some feedback and inputs, which were, could you highlight some of the points?
So CSE made a submission on the call for inputs that were issued by the supervisory body, and we made submissions on the appeals and grievance process. We basically highlighted that we had objections with the hefty fees that was imposed on grievance and bureaucratic procedures like filing of affidavits, bonds, and
which would essentially hinder communities who are a part of those projects from filing those.
Yes,
appeals.
especially in developing countries
Yeah.
where communities cannot pay that kind of a fine upfront.
Yeah.
So luckily for us, the supervisory body did do away with those elements from the final output.
Yeah. And I mean, those findings were also based on your 2023 study, which was on the voluntary carbon market in India. It's called Discredited. It's up on our website. So, yeah, Article 6, anything else that you want to add?
I think that's it.
Okay. We'll be writing about this more, so we'll come back to it. So back to you, Tamanna, about the big headline issue of the past 2 years, loss and damage. So at COP28, the loss and damage fund was operationalized with pledges of about $700 million. What's happening on loss and damage after that? I know some of the processes have now moved outside of the UNFCCC, but could you share some of the updates?
Yeah, sure. So yes, loss and damage, the fund being operationalized at Dubai was one of the biggest victories right on the first day. And the next steps were to have a board established for the fund. Although it was delayed, they did manage to finally convene the board and have its first meeting at earlier in May. And there were some sticky issues regarding the governance processes of the fund itself, which the board is now expecting to iron out further in the next meeting. So the next one is now scheduled in July. Although the loss and damage fund itself is not expected to be a big headliner at Bonn, there are expectations that there might be more clarity on how the loss and damage fund now is related to other loss and damage mechanisms like the Warsaw International Mechanism for loss and damage. So that is something we can expect to hear more from.
Right. And what about the global goal on adaptation? That there was also an outcome on that at COP28 in Dubai.
Right. That was also actually a text that got adopted, although it was in the last few days at COP28. And one more thing that happened after the text was adopted was the establishment of the UAE BELEM work program.
Right.
It's a 2-year program, and at Bonn, we are expecting it to be further ironed out on what the next steps for this particular work program is expected to be. The work program for now is aimed at fleshing out the indicators more to see how they can measure the targets of the global goal on adaptation. However, I think it's important to note here that although the GGA text was adopted, there was some agreement on the indicators themselves, but the finance language on the finance required to meet these indicators was touted as weak, and it was something that developing parties were not very happy about. So it might be interesting to see how that plays out.
Definitely. So, I mean, that really brings us to finance once again as kind of a wrap up. Finance permeates every discussion track from loss and damage, the global goal on adaptation, the mitigation work program, the NCQG, even Article 6. It's going to be the big header of the year. And I mean, as we say, finance is the ultimate enabler of mitigation, adaptation, decarbonization. So it's extremely crucial this year that we arrive at an ambitious outcome on the new collective quantified goal, as well as finance demands across negotiation tracks. So it's the year of finance, but it can't be the only year of finance. The calls have to only escalate from here onwards, because financing needs in developing countries for climate and development far outpace actual flows of financing, as we have seen through multiple reports, data sets. So I think that's it from us for now. This is the kind of the world context in which all of these climate negotiations are playing out. Is complicated. We are also seeing multiple geopolitical tensions. Of course, there's tremendous conflict, the devastation in Gaza, the ongoing Russia-Ukraine conflict. Those are occupying a lot of the priorities of many countries. We're also seeing geopolitical tensions in terms of escalating trade wars, and trade is an issue that we are working on and are excited to do more work on, talk more about. But there is an escalating global trade war, particularly for the new green economy, um, competing powers for global economic supremacy. So it's a complicated context in which these climate negotiations are taking place. It's important to consider all of these outside pressures when analyzing what countries are saying or not saying in the negotiation rooms. So that's the lens through which we look at these things. And yeah, and we will be at Bonn, and we have other colleagues here at CSE Down to Earth who will also be following. So do follow our updates, follow us on Twitter at CSE_climate, and of course CSE India, which is our main Twitter account. Am I missing anything else? Any
That's it.
final words?
Yeah.
Okay, that's it from us. Thank you for joining, and we'll get back to you from Bonn. Thanks a lot.